The sky over the Solomon Islands hung heavy on the morning of April 1st, 1943. Dawn came slowly, reluctant, as if the sun itself hesitated to illuminate what the day would bring. The air tasted of salt and aviation fuel, that particular metallic bite that fighter pilots learned to associate with mortality. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the palm trees swayed in the pre-dawn darkness, their fronds scraping against corrugated metal roofs like fingernails on a chalkboard. In the distance, the volcano Mount Austin brooded beneath a crown of mist, indifferent to the war being waged at its feet. If you find these stories of courage and strategy inspiring, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us keep these historical legacies alive. Lieutenant James Allen Swett sat in the ready room, nursing lukewarm coffee from a dented tin cup. He was 22 years old, though his face suggested someone younger, smooth-cheeked, with the kind of open, earnest expression that invited underestimation. His flight suit hung loose on his lean frame. He'd been in theater for exactly 3 weeks. 3 weeks of watching, listening, learning the rhythm of combat from men who measured experience not in months, but in kills. The veteran spoke a language he was still learning to understand, a dialect of deflection angles and energy states, of boom and zoom versus turn and burn, of survival encoded in jargon. Around him, the ready room buzzed with the particular tension that precedes a scramble. Cigarette smoke hung in horizontal layers beneath bare bulbs. The older pilots, men with 10, 15, 20 kills painted beneath their canopies, sat with the studied nonchalance of those who had learned to conserve emotional energy. They checked their watches. They dealt cards without looking at them. They spoke in low voices about nothing important, because speaking about important things before a mission was bad luck, and luck was the only god that mattered at 20,000 feet. Swett said nothing. He had learned in his brief time with VMF 221 that new pilots earned their voice through action, not words. The squadron called him Junior, sometimes Babyface. Once, memorably, the choir boy, after he'd declined to join a poker game to write a letter home to his wife. The nicknames weren't cruel exactly, but they carried weight. The weight of untested youth, of potential unfulfilled, of a man who might die before he ever mattered. The telephone rang at 0730 hours. The ready room fell silent with the particular stillness of men who know that sound. The duty officer lifted the receiver, listened, nodded once. When he spoke, his voice carried no inflection whatsoever. Bogies inbound, big formation, all aircraft scramble. The room exploded into motion. Henderson Field had been American soil for 8 months, one at a cost measured in malaria and blood. The island itself remained contested. Japanese troops still held positions in the jungle, launching night raids, interdicting supply lines, making every pilot who closed his eyes wonder if he'd wake to the sound of rifle fire. But the airfield was American, and from this muddy strip carved from coconut plantations and coral dust, the United States Marine Corps was learning to master the art of forward-deployed fighter operations. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat was not a beautiful aircraft. Where the Japanese Zero was grace incarnate, all elegant lines and lethal maneuverability, the Wildcat was a flying brick, a barrel with wings, designed by engineers who valued survival over aesthetics. It climbed slower than a Zero. It turned wider than a Zero. In any conventional understanding of air combat, it was outmatched, but the Wildcat had 2 advantages that mattered more than speed or agility. It could absorb punishment that would tear a Zero apart, and it carried 6 50 caliber machine guns that could saw an enemy aircraft in half. American pilots had learned to weaponize these advantages through tactics developed in blood. Never turn with a Zero, never try to climb with a Zero. Instead, use altitude to build speed. Dive, strike, extend away. Boom and zoom. The Thatch Weave, developed by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, transformed pairs of Wildcats into mutually supporting elements that could defeat superior numbers through geometry and discipline. The Zero was faster, more agile, more responsive, but the Wildcat, properly employed by pilots who understood energy management, was deadlier. Swett had absorbed this doctrine in ground school, in flight training, in the 3 weeks of patrol missions that had shown him empty sky after empty sky. He understood it intellectually, but intellectual understanding and visceral knowledge were separated by an abyss that could only be crossed through combat. And combat, for James Swett, remained theoretical. Until April 1st, 1943. The scramble was organized chaos. Pilots sprinted across the flight line, boots pounding on PSP, pierced steel planking that transformed mud into something approximating a runway. Plane captains already had engines turning, propellers catching dawn light as they chopped the humid air into wind. Swett climbed into his assigned aircraft, number 13, and felt his parachute straps dig into his shoulders as the crew chief cinched them tight. The chief, a corporal from Nebraska with grease permanently embedded in the lines of his face, leaned close to shout over the engine roar. "Bring her back in one piece, sir." Swett nodded. He could not yet know that bringing her back would be the least impressive thing he'd do that day. Takeoff was a controlled stampede, 12 Wildcats clawing into the sky in loose formation, climbing hard toward Angels 20. Swett flew wing on Captain Joseph Foss, the squadron's leading ace, a man with 19 confirmed kills and eyes the color of winter ice. Foss flew like he breathed economically, efficiently, without wasted motion. Swett worked his throttle and stick to maintain position, feeling the Wildcat's weight, sensing the subtropical air's reduced density affecting lift and power. The radio crackled. "Bandits at Angels 15, bearing 340, range 20 miles, big raid, estimate 40-plus aircraft." 40-plus. Swett's mouth went dry. The largest formation he'd ever seen was 6 aircraft, in training, over San Diego, under blue California skies that had never known war. Foss's voice came through, calm as Sunday morning. "Stay in formation, don't chase. Pick your targets, make your ammo count." The words were meant for everyone, but Swett felt them aimed at him. The rookie, the untested, the one whose presence was tolerated but not yet valued. They climbed through layers of cloud, emerging into crystalline sunlight at 18,000 feet. The Solomon Islands spread beneath them like crumpled green silk thrown across impossible blue. From this height, the war disappeared. The burned-out Japanese positions, the foxholes, the improvised cemeteries, all invisible. Just beauty, vast and indifferent. Then someone called, "Tally-ho, 11 o'clock low." Swett looked, his breath caught. The Japanese formation was immense, a river of aircraft flowing south toward Henderson Field. Bombers in the center, fat Aichi D-3A, Val dive bombers in their distinctive fixed landing gear configuration. And surrounding them, above them, weaving through them like sharks through a school of fish, were the escorts, Mitsubishi A6M-0s. Their elliptical wings catching sunlight as they scissored through their patrol patterns. 40-plus had been an underestimate. Swett counted 50 aircraft in the time it took to draw breath. Maybe more. Foss's voice cut through. "We're going in. Finger 4. Take the bombers first." The Wildcats rolled, inverted, and dove. Combat flight is not like ground combat. On the ground, terrain provides. Reference gravity remains constant. Confusion unfolds in comprehensible dimensions. But air combat is three-dimensional chess played at 300 miles per hour, where every decision must account for altitude, airspeed, angle off, closure rate, and the physics of energy states. A pilot who climbs too aggressively bleeds speed and becomes vulnerable. A pilot who dives too steeply builds speed, but sacrifices altitude, the potential energy that, once squandered, cannot be quickly regained. Every maneuver is a transaction with gravity and momentum, and the exchange rate is written in blood. Swett followed Foss into the dive. The airspeed indicator wound up. 200 knots, 250, 280. The Wildcat began to buffet, the airframe protesting stresses it was never designed to enjoy. Swett's vision narrowed, not from fear, but from focus. The bomber formation swelled from distant specks to individual aircraft, their cowlings and canopies resolving into discrete details. Foss pulled up behind a Val, fired a burst, and the bomber staggered as 50 caliber rounds walked up its fuselage. Smoke trailed, black and oily. The Val nosed down, falling away. Swett selected his own target, another Val, slightly separated from the formation. He let the pipper settle, squeezed the trigger. The Wildcat shuddered as 6 machine guns spoke in unison. Tracers arced out, brilliant against the blue, and intersected the Val's left wing route. Metal peeled away, the wing folded upward, and the bomber spun into a death spiral. First kill. Swett felt nothing. No exhilaration, no horror. Only a kind of cold clarity, as if part of his mind had stepped back to observe what his hands were doing. The radio exploded with voices. "Zero on your 6! Break right! I'm hit!" The disciplined formation dissolved into individual struggles for survival. Swett pulled up, looked around, and realized he was alone. In the chaos of the attack, the squadron had fragmented. Wildcats and Zeros tangled in knife fights scattered across 5 miles of sky. Smoke trails marked the trajectory of dying aircraft, though, whether American or Japanese, Swett couldn't immediately tell. The bomber formation had scattered, individual Vals diving toward Henderson Field or fleeing north, pursued by Wildcats. And 8 Zeros. 8 had apparently decided that the quiet rookie, separated from his flight, represented an acceptable target. The Japanese Zero was more than an aircraft. It was a philosophy made manifest. Designed by Jiro Horikoshi, the A6M embodied the principle of trading protection for performance. Its airframe was light, almost fragile, constructed from a special aluminum alloy that reduced weight at the cost of durability. It carried no armor plate to protect the pilot. Its fuel tanks were unprotected, prone to catastrophic fire when struck. But these sacrifices purchased capabilities that seemed impossible. A combat radius exceeding 1,000 miles, a climb, rate that embarrassed anything America could field, and maneuverability so extreme that pilots who survived dogfights with Zeros spoke of them in terms bordering on reverence. By April 1943, Zero pilots had been fighting for nearly 2 years. They had cut their teeth over China, perfected their craft over Pearl Harbor and the Philippines, and bled across the campaigns in the Dutch East Indies and the Solomons. The men flying those 8 Zeros approaching James Swett were not novices. They were survivors, which in the brutal Darwinism of air combat meant they were skilled, ruthless, and utterly confident in their superiority over American pilots. They closed on Swett in a textbook Intercept, 4 high, 4 low, cutting off his escape routes, herding him like a wounded animal. The lead Zero fired a ranging burst. Tracers floated past Swett's canopy, deceptively slow-looking at distance, though each round traveled faster than sound. Swett's hands moved. The motions were not thought through, no time for thought, but drawn from hundreds of hours in the cockpit, from the muscle memory inscribed through endless practice. He slammed the stick forward, diving hard, trading altitude for speed. The Wildcat's nose dropped toward the ocean, now visible 5 miles below, a sheet of wrinkled blue. The Zeros followed. Standard Zero tactics involved using superior maneuverability to force an opponent into a turning fight, where the Japanese aircraft's advantages became decisive. American pilots who accepted that fight died. Swett had no intention of turning. Instead, he dove, watching his airspeed build, 300 knots, 320, 350, pushing the Wildcat toward the edge of its structural limits. Behind him, the Zeros dove as well, but here, the physics of energy management became Swett's unlikely ally. The Zero was lighter, more maneuverable, but its lighter wing loading meant it accelerated more slowly in a dive. The Wildcat, heavier, denser, fell like the brick it resembled. The gap began to open. Not much, not enough, but some. Swett pulled out of the dive at 2,000 feet, his vision graying as G-forces compressed his blood downward, away from his brain. The Wildcat groaned, metal flexing, rivets straining. He leveled off, barely above the wavetops, flying so low that his prop wash kicked up spray. The Zeros pulled out behind him, not all 8 simultaneously, but staggered, their intercept formation disrupted by the dive's violence. And in that disruption, Swett saw not 8 aircraft, but 8 individual problems, no longer mutually supporting, no longer coordinated. He hauled back on the stick, pulled the Wildcat into a vertical climb, not to gain altitude, but to bleed speed, to force the following Zeros to overshoot. The maneuver violated every doctrine he'd been taught. Climbing while pursued by superior aircraft was suicide. Except it wasn't. The lead Zero, committed to his attack, flashed past Swett's climbing, Wildcat, unable to slow, geometry and momentum transformed into vulnerability. For one heartbeat, a single crystalline instant, the Zero hung in Swett's gun sight, crossing from left to right, canopy and engine cowling perfectly aligned. Swett fired. The .50 caliber round struck the Zero amidships. The aircraft seemed to pause in midair, as if considering its options, then came apart in a brilliant orange fireball. Pieces of wing and fuselage tumbled toward the ocean, trailing flame and smoke. Second kill. But 7 Zeros remained, and now they were angry. What happened next would be analyzed, debated, and studied in tactics courses for decades. The official after-action report, filed by Captain Foss based on Swett's debriefing, would use clinical language. Lieutenant Swett engaged multiple enemy aircraft in low-altitude combat, employing vertical maneuvers and deflection, shooting to defeat numerically superior forces. But clinical language cannot capture the reality of what James Swett did in the skies over Tulagi Bay. He fought not like a rookie, not like a veteran, but like a man who had transcended the distinction entirely. He fought with a purity of focus that erased fear, erased doubt, erased everything except the geometric problems unfolding at 300 miles per hour. Turn, fire, climb, dive, turn again. Each maneuver flowed into the next, with an inevitability that seemed choreographed, though no choreography could account for the chaos, the smoke, the tracer's stitching patterns through humid air. A Zero dove on him from above. Swett snap-rolled inverted, pulled through, came out underneath his attacker, fired a 3-second burst. The Zero's engine seized, propeller freezing, and the aircraft nosed down into the ocean, striking the water flat and skipping twice before disintegrating. Third kill. 2 more Zeros converged from opposite directions, attempting to trap him in a scissors maneuver. Swett chopped his throttle, extended his flaps, a maneuver that should have made him a stationary target, but timed it so that both Zeros overshot simultaneously, their closure rate too high to compensate. He retracted the flaps, advanced the throttle, climbed after the nearer Zero, closed to 50 yards, point-blank range, and fired. The Zero exploded, its unprotected fuel tanks igniting in a magnesium-white flash. Fourth kill. His ammunition was running low. The Wildcat carried enough .50 caliber rounds for approximately 30 seconds of continuous fire, though no pilot ever fired continuously. Swett had been disciplined, rationing his shots, but 4 kills had consumed perhaps 20 seconds of ammunition. He had maybe 10 seconds remaining. 3 Zeros left. They hung back now, circling at distance, wary of closing. Japanese pilots were aggressive, but they were not suicidal. They had watched this supposed rookie, this quiet American they had assumed would be easy prey, destroy half their number in less than 10 minutes. The calculus had changed. Swett knew he should run. Doctrine dictated disengagement when ammunition ran low. But something had shifted inside him during the fight. Some fundamental recalibration of what he understood himself capable of doing. He didn't feel invincible. He was too intelligent for that. But he felt certain, not certain he would survive, but certain he would not run. He turned toward the nearest Zero. The Japanese pilot, perhaps surprised by the aggression, perhaps simply unlucky, hesitated. It was a tiny hesitation, a fraction of a second. But in air combat, fractions compound into fatalities. Swett closed the distance, positioned himself directly astern, and fired his last long burst. The Zero staggered, smoke pouring from its engine, then nosed down toward the water. 5th kill. The 2 remaining Zeros broke off. Swett watched them recede north, climbing into clouds, their commitment to the fight exhausted. He was alone above Tulagi Bay, his Wildcat shot, full of holes he hadn't noticed acquiring, his ammunition expended, his fuel gauge reading near empty. Below him, the bay was littered with debris, burning oil slicks, floating wreckage, here and there an empty life raft or a parachute settling onto the water's surface. The Japanese raid had been broken. How many other pilots had engaged, how many bombers had been destroyed before reaching Henderson Field? Swett didn't know. He knew only that he had faced 8 aircraft and destroyed 5, and that he was still alive, and that the shaking in his hands was not fear, but adrenaline draining away. He turned south, toward Henderson Field, toward home. The landing was not heroic. Swett's Wildcat, damaged in ways he hadn't fully assessed, coughed and sputtered as he lined up on the runway. The engine quit 500 feet from the threshold. He glided in, dead stick, touched down hard, and rolled to a stop halfway down the strip. Silence, profound and ringing. He sat in the cockpit for a long moment, hands still on the stick and throttle, while his ground crew sprinted toward him. When they reached the aircraft, they stopped, staring. The Wildcat's fuselage was stitched with bullet holes, rounds that had missed Swett by inches. One .50 caliber round had struck his canopy frame, leaving a fist-sized crater in the metal. How he hadn't been hit, wasn't killed, couldn't be explained by skill alone. The crew chief, the same corporal from Nebraska who'd wished him luck that morning, climbed onto the wing and looked at Swett through the canopy. His face was pale. "Jesus Christ, Lieutenant, what the hell happened up there?" Swett unbuckled, climbed out, stood on the wing on legs that trembled. He looked at the damage to his aircraft, the holes, the bent metal, the hydraulic fluid leaking onto the PSP. He looked at the sky, empty now, blue and innocent. He said, "I got 5. It was not bravado. It was not false modesty. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered in the same tone one might use to report the weather." The debriefing took 3 hours. Intelligence officers cross-examined Swett, correlated his account with reports from other pilots, with radar tracks, with ground observers' testimonies. The initial skepticism, 5 kills on your first combat mission, gave way to confirmation. Foss himself had witnessed 2 of the kills. Other pilots had seen the furball over Tulagi Bay, seen the Zeros falling. The wreckage would later be located, photographed, documented. 5 confirmed kills, 7 if partial credits from shared bomber destructions were included, in a single mission. By a pilot with 3 weeks in theater. The squadron's attitude toward Swett shifted with tectonic finality. The nicknames, Junior, Babyface, Choir Boy, disappeared overnight, replaced by silence that was itself a form of respect. The veterans who had measured him and found him untested now measured him differently. They had seen quiet men before, serious men, earnest men, but quiet men who destroyed 5 enemy aircraft in their first engagement were not rookies. They were killers who happened to be polite. Swett didn't understand the shift, not entirely. He'd done what he'd been trained to do. He'd applied doctrine, managed energy states, converted theoretical knowledge into action. That he'd survived felt less like skill than luck, the kind of dumb, inexplicable luck that kept certain rounds from connecting, that positioned enemies where his gun sight happened to be pointing, that made fuel last long enough to reach home. But others saw something different. They saw a man who'd been thrown into chaos and emerged with 5 kills. They saw a pilot who'd faced 8-to-1 odds and won. They saw the future written in cordite and blood, and the future looked like James Swett. The United States military's approach to warfare was, by 1943, revealing itself as fundamentally different from Japanese methodology. Japan had entered the Pacific War with a cohort of superbly trained pilots, men who'd accumulated thousands of flight hours, who embodied Bushido's martial virtues, who saw themselves as an elite warrior class. But Japan's industrial capacity couldn't replace losses. Every veteran pilot killed over Guadalcanal, over Midway, over New Guinea, represented irreplaceable expertise. The pool of experience was draining, and nothing refilled it. America's approach was democratic, industrial, systematic. Pilots were not elite warriors cultivated through years of training. They were products of an assembly line, flight schools scattered across the continent, churning out aviators by the thousand. They arrived in theater younger, less experienced, more expendable. But behind them came more, always more. The losses that would cripple Japan's air groups were, to America, acceptable attrition rates, tragic but sustainable, part of a larger calculation involving industrial output and training infrastructure. James Swett was the embodiment of this system. 22 years old, 3 weeks in combat, no special lineage, no elite pedigree. Just a young man from California who'd learned to fly, learned to fight, and learned to survive. One of thousands. But those thousands collectively represented a force that Japan could not match, could not exhaust, could not defeat through individual excellence. In the weeks following April 1st, Swett flew 37 more combat missions. He destroyed additional aircraft, though never again in the spectacular numbers of his first engagement. He was shot down twice, rescued once by friendly forces, once by islanders who hid him from Japanese patrols until evacuation could be arranged. He contracted malaria, lost 15 pounds, recovered, returned to flight status. He watched friends die, some quickly in brilliant fireballs visible from miles away, some slowly in field hospitals where morphine and prayer were the only available treatments. In September 1943, 6 months after his first combat mission, James Swett was awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation praised his aggressive tactics and outstanding courage. It did not mention that he'd been a rookie, that veterans had underestimated him, that his quiet demeanor had been mistaken for weakness. Those details didn't matter to the medal, but they mattered to the story, because the story was never really about James Swett, the quiet rookie who destroys 8 intercepting aircraft, or 5, depending on how one counts partial credits, represents something larger than individual heroism. He represents the democratization of excellence, the idea that competence can emerge from anywhere, that underestimation is a failure of perception rather than reality. The veterans who mocked Swett, or at least dismissed him, were not cruel men. They were realistic men, operating from experience that taught them most. New pilots died quickly, that survival required seasoning, that quiet rookies were usually just quiet rookies. But they had mistaken silence for absence. Swett's quietness was not emptiness waiting to be filled with experience. It was discipline, focus, the kind of internal economy that conserves energy for moments when conservation means survival. The Japanese pilots who engaged him that day made a different error. They saw a lone wildcat, separated from formation, and saw prey. They failed to account for the possibility that prey might be predator, that the isolated American might be isolated by choice rather than misfortune, that their 8-to-1 advantage was less decisive than it appeared. Both failures, the veterans' underestimation, the Japanese pilots' miscalculation, stemmed from the same source, an assumption that experience and competence were synonymous, that youth and capability were inversely proportional. Swett shattered that assumption at 300 miles per hour, 5 miles above the Pacific, on a clear April morning when the sky was empty of everything except violence and possibility. There is a photograph of James Swett, taken sometime in mid-1943 after the Medal of Honor ceremony, but before he returned stateside for a war bond tour. He stands beside a wildcat, hands in his pockets, expression neutral. The photographer has positioned him so that the 5 kill markings beneath his canopy are visible, 5 small Japanese flags, each representing a destroyed aircraft. Swett is not smiling. He is not posing. He is simply standing, waiting for the photographer to finish, his mind perhaps already on the next mission, the next flight, the next problem to be solved at altitude. That photograph circulated in newspapers, in training manuals, in the kind of propaganda materials that America generated, with the same industrial efficiency it applied to aircraft production. It was intended to inspire, to demonstrate that American youth could match Japanese skill, that farm boys and college students could become aces, that the quiet ones might surprise everyone. But the photograph's power lies in what it doesn't show. It doesn't show the 8 zeros converging, the snap decisions made in fractions of seconds, the geometric calculations performed at speeds that preclude conscious thought. It doesn't show the terror. Swett admitted in later interviews that he'd been terrified, that only discipline prevented panic from translating into fatal errors. It doesn't show the luck, dumb and inexplicable, that kept Japanese rounds from connecting, that positioned enemies in gunsight crosshairs, that made 5 kills possible rather than 5 deaths. What the photograph shows is aftermath. A young man standing beside a machine marked with symbols representing destroyed lives. He looks tired. He looks ordinary. He looks exactly like what he was. A pilot doing a job, one mission in a war that stretched across oceans and years, one moment of violence in a conflict that would eventually consume millions of moments. And yet, that ordinariness is itself extraordinary. Because April 1st, 1943 demonstrated that excellence didn't require pedigree, that capability could emerge from unexpected sources, that the quiet rookie might possess reserves of skill and determination invisible until circumstances demanded their revelation. The war continued. James Swett continued. He survived his combat tour, returned to the United States, trained new pilots, returned to combat, survived again. He lived until 2009, dying at age 88, having outlasted the war by 64 years. In interviews conducted late in life, he spoke of April 1st with a kind of bemused detachment, as if discussing events that had happened to someone else. "I did what I was trained to do," he'd say. "I got lucky." Both statements were true, though neither was complete. The veterans who'd underestimated him became his greatest advocates. Foss, in particular, spoke of Swett with something approaching awe, describing him as the most naturally gifted deflection shooter he'd ever seen. Other squadron mates remembered the quiet competence, the way Swett maintained his aircraft personally, checking every rivet and hydraulic line, the way he studied gunnery manuals by flashlight in his tent, the way he approached combat as a problem to be solved rather than a test to be endured. The Japanese pilots who survived encounters with him, and some did survive, the war-producing survivors on both sides, never knew his name. To them, he was just another American pilot, one of thousands, part of the faceless industrial mass that overwhelmed their carefully cultivated expertise through sheer numeric superiority. They could not know that the quiet rookie they had tried to intercept on April 1st would become an ace, a Medal of Honor recipient, a symbol of American capability. They knew only that they'd lost comrades, that the mission had failed, that the easy kill had become a nightmare. Henderson Field exists still, though under a different name, reclaimed by peace, its coral runways long since paved over or abandoned to vegetation. The skies above Tulagi Bay are empty of violence now, trafficked only by commercial aircraft, following routes that cross battlefields without acknowledging them. The ocean has absorbed the wreckage, the oil slicks, the debris of April 1st, 1943, leaving no trace visible to satellite or ship. But traces remain in other forms. In the after-action reports filed by intelligence officers, their typed pages yellowing in archives. In the photographs of a young man standing beside an aircraft marked with 5 kills. In the Medal of Honor. Citation, framed and displayed, its language formal and inadequate to capture what happened when 8 aircraft converged on one and one emerged victorious. And in the lesson, transmitted through generations of fighter pilots, that combat reveals rather than creates capability, that the quiet ones might possess depths invisible to casual observation, that underestimation is a gift to the underestimated, a cognitive advantage that can be weaponized as surely as 650 caliber machine guns. James Allen Swett climbed into a Wildcat on April 1st, 1943 as a rookie, untested, unproven, underestimated. He landed 6 hours later as an ace, his name destined for history books, his actions studied in tactics courses, his survival a testament to skill, discipline, training, and the kind of luck that no doctrine can teach and no analysis can explain. The veterans stopped mocking him, the squadron stopped calling him junior, the enemy stopped assuming that separation meant vulnerability, that youth meant incompetence, that quiet meant weak. Because on a clear April morning, above the Solomon Islands, a quiet rookie proved that the only opinion that mattered was gravity's, and that physics didn't care about nicknames, only about energy states and deflection angles and the cold mathematics of survival. And in that proving, James Swett demonstrated what America's industrial democracy could produce. Not elite warriors cultivated through aristocratic tradition, but competent young men manufactured by the thousand, each one potentially lethal, each one potentially extraordinary, each one ready to transform from underestimated rookie into ace in the span of a single morning's violence. The sky kept no record, the ocean absorbed the evidence, but the story remained, passed from veteran to rookie, generation to generation. A reminder that excellence announces itself through action, not words, and that the quietest voice in the ready room might belong to the most dangerous pilot in the sky. April 1st, 1943, a date that mattered to very few, changed the trajectory of one life completely, and ended 5 others in fire and falling metal. Just another day in a war that produced 10,000 such days, each one its own story of courage and terror and survival and loss. But on that particular day, above those particular waters, a quiet, rookie named James Allen Swett stopped being a rookie entirely, and became something the enemy would learn to fear and his comrades would learn to trust. a pilot who made the impossible look routine, who transformed 8-to-1 odds into 5 confirmed kills, who demonstrated that in the democracy of combat, competence matters more than credentials, and that sometimes, not often, but sometimes, the underestimated are underestimated for a reason. They underestimate themselves least of all. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this historical deep dive, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which historical figure we should cover next.